Hello and welcome back everybody. It's time for another astrology lesson, and in today's video we're going to be talking about retrogrades in the natal chart. Not retrogrades in the transits. We'll be talking about that another time, giving a good breakdown on all of them. And I wanted to do this because, a lot of people stigmatize, the idea of retrogrades. They kind of don't get a whole lot, of course, from, those of us doing horoscopes, because it's like, we'll talk about a retrograde once, and then we'll move on to another thing. Sometimes you'll see things on blogs, or you'll see articles out there that give a little bit of misinformation, and all of a sudden we think retrogrades are bad, or we think retrogrades are inherently, going to always do bad. Perhaps all retrogrades are the same. To be frank, I'm going to put it out there right now, we actually all, for the most part, will find that it's rarer to not have a retrograde in your chart. There are times of year where all planets are moving directly, depending on the time of year, depending on the century, what's going on with the ellipticals, but it's more than likely you have one or two retrogrades yourself. I know I have retrogrades in my chart. My Jupiter's retrograde, for instance, my Neptune's retrograde, for instance. So people have retrogrades. It just happens. It's nothing to be upset about, nothing to, worry about, and it's, we're going to break it down how it works. Now, the first thing I do want to make a point of saying, again, as I differentiated in the beginning, natal chart retrogrades and transiting retrogrades are not the same thing. If you hear about, say, a Mars retrograde in the sky, and an astrologer is making a prediction about what that's going to do, that is not the same as what Mars retrograde in your natal chart means or how it will affect you in life, okay? That is a very, very different thing, and so you've got to hold on to it, okay? You've got to hold on to that, or else it's going to, because every once in a while we'll hear something and they'll catastrophize a little bit. And there are some astrologers out there who make a name for themselves by catastrophizing. They're not hard to find. Anyway, so moving on. So what does that mean exactly when we talk about a natal chart retrograde? It's not bad. Is it always good? Well, the way I look at retrogrades is that they're kind of like inverted or reversed tarot cards. Those have a lot of superstitions about them as well. The truth of the matter is that if you reverse a tarot card, it's actually going to it's going to be the case that the vocabulary of the deck is doubled. We've just got more going on and more to talk about. The balance of positive, negative, and neutral is still in the cards. You just doubled the amount of cards you're reading, so to speak. And, when we think about planets themselves, not all planets are 100% negative or 100% positive. Well, if they go retrograde, they're not all 100% negative, 100% positive. Some planets, say the inner planets, especially that Mars, Venus, and Mercury retrograde, yeah, they're a bit more personal, they can present more challenges. And some of the outer planets, the Pluto, the Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, those are a little bit more challenging, I think, sometimes when they're direct, and easier when they're retrograde. So it's important to pay attention to what's going on, and again, try not to simplify that, try not to oversimplify that kind of thing too much. So, the way I like to look at retrogrades in a person's chart is I not only want to look at what planet is retrograde, but it's also important to know what sign that planet rules, right? And what house is that planet the ruler of, or the lord of, depending on how you want to term it. That is going to show you what the lesson is. Now remember, we're not slaves to our chart. We are not bound to our chart. Our chart is not a scapegoat, nor is it a dog ate our homework kind of excuse. It's just letting us know what our lessons are. We already talked about that a bit with the aspects video. Not people are all doomed and fixed to their chart. Retrogrades are no different. So, I want to do a breakdown of the planets themselves when they're retrograde to kind of give an idea in the context of a natal chart, and then we'll talk a little bit more about looking at rulers, and we'll break down my retrogrades, Neptune retrograde and Jupiter retrograde, and give you an example as we go through, and I'll tell you how that all works. One thing I do want to mention though before we break it down, some genius is going to make a point of saying, yes, there is no such thing as a planet going backwards. That, the planets don't necessarily retrograde, and actually move backwards. It's an optical illusion that comes based on their elliptical and our elliptical orbit. And that's very true. However, it does change how that energy is hitting us. It's how it's affecting the planet, so to speak. It's kind of like if you took a ball and a hose, and they were moving on an elliptical. The hose spraying the ball, when things start to change and all of a sudden the ball's orbit and the hose's orbit, or the hose's movement, are different, you've got the energy staying in one spot. You've got the water on the ball not doing what it would normally do. It's not, the energy or the water itself is not being distributed the same way on the ball. And that's how retrogrades actually affect us. No, they're not actually moving backwards in the sky, but it does change our relationship to the current, the energy currents coming off of those planets. So anyway, let's get started with everyone's favorite. Let's talk about Mercury retrograde. Now, again, remember, we're talking about natal chart, not predictive, not present-day transit chart Mercury. We're talking about if it's in your natal chart or in somebody's natal chart. Now, Mercury retrograde, remember, Mercury rules our communication, our thought process, how we actually convey our ideas. It may talk a little bit about the way we demonstrate our abilities. It can also talk about how fast and how productive we are in terms of quickness. Remember, it's the planet of haste and speed and communication, as well as technology to a certain degree, but technology is not very much impacted, like outside technology is not impacted by the natal chart so much as the internal, again, mental aspects of Mercury are. When a person has Mercury retrograde in the natal chart, fun fact, a lot of times we tend to see somebody who may actually most likely become some kind of writer, some kind of historian in some way. We tend to see a lot of authors and a lot of journalists actually have an easy time getting into work, documenting and, and again, freezing history, taking pictures of history. Photographers can often have Mercury retrograde in their natal chart as well. So all of those people tend to have a good relationship with technology, so obviously it doesn't work out there. At least not in the way that we see textbook Mercury retrograde for predictions. Mercury retrograde can show up where a person is learning a lesson about learning to communicate effectively. A lot of the times with Mercury retrograde, vocal communication might not necessarily be the easiest thing for this person to do. That's why they tend to be better at visual communication, written communication, symbolic communication. A lot of the times Mercury retrograde can also indicate a situation where a person is more reactive. They tend to play a more reactive game with their life, in conversations. They tend to also do a better job of, again, documenting what they are witnessing. This is usually a person who is able to see what is normally going on behind the scenes because they're not actually always participating in the conversation. They do have a tendency to sometimes isolate themselves and to cut themselves off, which is not really a good thing. And sometimes with Mercury retrograde, a person may not necessarily speak up as promptly as they should for the best interest of all concerned. Sometimes you can see this in a person's chart. If a person has, say, Mercury retrograde in their 4th house of home and family, they may not necessarily, speak up in situations where they are when they're at home in their natal family, or maybe they don't tend to speak up very much when it comes to raising their own family. If they've got Mercury retrograde in their partnership sector, they may not necessarily be as vocal about what they like and what they don't like in the relationship. And sometimes, again, not being vocal means we can build a bit of resentment because we're not getting what we want, but we're not being vocal either. So there are lessons involved. Again, there's definitely an opportunity to fix this, but it's something that's kind of there. It's a tendency that's already sort of built in that needs to be worked out. Of course, always look at what, again, house that Mercury retrograde is in and what house that Mercury rules in order to know a little bit more about what's going on there. Venus, when retrograde, Venus, remember, is the planet of love, harmony, attraction, and emotional currency. So when Venus goes retrograde, a lot of the times it can talk about insecurity a little bit. When Venus goes retrograde in a transit chart, people tend to get very insecure about the subject of whatever house it's in when it's transiting. And people with Venus retrograde in their charts may have a bit of an insecurity about something that is underdeveloped in their astrology chart. Again, it depends on the house. It could also depend on what house that Venus rules. When we have Venus retrograde, it's important to learn to become more secure with that so we aren't actually always on the defense. Sometimes when we have Venus retrograde, it can make a person tend to be very defensive and perhaps even lash out a little bit about this area, or to be a little bit too aggressive to overcompensate for the insecurity there. It's because the poor person's also always looking over their shoulder because they're always worried they're going to get fired, they're going to get sacked, they're going to have a competitor come and take over. A lot of the times with Venus retrograde, you know, it can also show a spot where a person is having a hard time being satisfied with that house that it's in, and it's hard for them to find satisfaction in that house, and the lesson is learning how to put enough love in to actually bring satisfaction there. Sometimes people with Venus retrograde in the 11th house have a hard time being satisfied with their social support system. You know, their friends they don't necessarily trust with important details. They have a hard time building deep friendships because they're insecure about the information that they would share, or perhaps they don't think people would treat it very well. It can also turn into competitive stuff as well, especially if they get insecure about what's going on. But again, it all comes back to perhaps feeling a bit too self-conscious. Whereas Mercury retrograde prompts a person to kind of act inward. Venus retrograde can make it so it's hard for a person not to act out, but it's really not meant to seem aggressive. It's more like, again, an overcompensation that needs some, you know, TLC, love and balance, in whatever house it's in. When we have Mars retrograde in a person's chart, very similar to Mercury, it can show up where a person is not doing something promptly, or they may have a bad habit of not doing something promptly. Only with Mercury retrograde being they're not speaking up promptly, Mars retrograde can indicate too long to act. Mars retrograde can indicate a person who may not fight their own battles very well, they may not defend themselves very well, or they may not correct the wrong action of themselves or others fast. They're not very, you know, diligent about damage control. Sometimes we can see too much passivity with this, and so it's important to be able to turn that around, if that makes sense. With Mars retrograde, it's not necessarily a bad thing. We tend to see people who are very diplomatic. We tend to see people who are actually very good peacemakers, very good at getting people to reconcile their differences outside themselves. But we do have a tendency to see somebody who, again, may not necessarily champion their own cause. Again, very much kind of like the action complement to Mercury retrograde. You know, they don't act fast enough. And they need to work on acting faster when it comes to handling problems in their space. Again, the inner planets tend to present more challenges than ease. And I don't want anyone who has one, a Mercury retrograde or a Mars retrograde or a Venus retrograde in their chart to, you know, get upset about this or feel self-conscious about it. I mean, when we're talking about Mercury retrograde goes, you know, happens about, you know, it happens 3 times a year. Okay, it happens 3 times a year and it happens for about 3 weeks each time. So 9 weeks out of the year, that's a lot of people, all right? That's over 10% of people are going to have, you know, Mercury retrograde. So if it's more than 1 in 10, don't worry about it. Venus retrograde and Mars retrograde each go retrograde for about 2 months every 2 years. It's slightly more uncommon, but when you think about it, no, it's not. And again, it's not going to affect your whole chart, just the spot it's in and the house it rules. And again, we're not slaves to our chart. We have things that just mean that this is a lesson that we've come to work on. So moving on to the outer planets, okay, to keep it simple, we'll go on to the outer planets here. Let's talk about Jupiter retrograde. Jupiter retrograde's a funny one to kind of have in the middle, because it does start to talk a little bit about how retrogrades, you know, are not so hard to deal with, and sometimes they can be good and bad at the same time. Now, with Jupiter retrograde, Jupiter usually goes retrograde 4 months, but, you know, a long time. So a lot of people will have Jupiter retrograde. 1 in 3 people will most likely have Jupiter retrograde in their charts. So, you know, don't be surprised if you do. I like to paraphrase the Jupiter retrograde as the Cinderella story. And you tend to have a Cinderella story in that part of your chart, the house that it's in. So it can be negative when you think about the fact that it's a rough start. Usually for about the first 35 years of this person's life, that part of that person's chart is not an easy thing to deal with. Take it, in my chart, for instance, my Jupiter is retrograde in my 4th house of home and family. I did not have an easy childhood, my upbringing was riddled with divorce, lots of moving around, growing up very poor, and it was just not an easy thing to deal with. And I've still got some, difficulties with my family that I'm still, trying to work out as a result of that. Things are starting to, change for me as I'm an adult. And a lot of the times we tend to see Jupiter retrograde going, okay, after that first Saturn return, again, after ages 28, 29, and 30, things are starting to turn into that Cinderella story. Things are a little bit better. Maybe this person's doing better when it comes to their quality of life, their home life, their living situation. Maybe this Jupiter retrogrades in their friendship circle, they're finding better friends, or maybe it's in a financial area, they're doing better when it comes to their money and wealth. So Jupiter retrograde will talk about a very, very wonderful sort of latter 2/3 of life, but a very difficult first third of that person's life. Jupiter retrograde also, again, affects the ruling, the sign it rules. So, Jupiter rules Sagittarius. Sagittarius is the ruler of my 3rd house. Believe it or not, I actually do have some half-siblings that I reunited with when I was an adult, after I became an adult. I'm actually, connecting with family members that I've been estranged from due to stuff from when I was a child that were out of my control, and so it's all coming back. So it's kind of like you deal with this loss and you deal with it coming back together. It is a Cinderella story in a big way, so you may be noticing that about your Jupiter retrograde if you have one. Saturn retrograde in a person's chart is a very interesting one to have as well, because Saturn, again, when retrograde, tends to talk a little bit more about ease. Now we have something that is still, let's just say, neutral. It's still equal parts good and bad, but it's not hitting as hard as you'd think. Saturn retrograde talks about a person not having so many issues or challenges in a given space of that chart. Saturn tends to maybe ease off. It can indicate a lack of controlling elements, good or bad. This can, however, talk about a lack of mentorship or a lack of education in this area. Saturn retrograde, however, again, can talk about a place where there will not be obstacles, or the obstacles that could be presented there are really not as powerful as they could be. This could be indicating, again, if Saturn's retrograde in a person's 9th house, where people would normally have to jump hurdles to, say, work abroad, get into university, things like that. Saturn retrograde is kind of saying, no, they've got a little bit more of a backstage pass into these areas. It would be easier for them to take that and roll with it if they want. However, with Saturn retrograde, again, it's very important to know that sometimes when things come easy to us, it's not exactly easy for us to learn how to be the master and authority of this area. And we don't want to necessarily always be looking for the authority figure who's been giving us a bye on so many good opportunities. Either way, Saturn retrograde, not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Another thing about Saturn retrograde that can be a challenge, even though we've got overwhelming ease energy in here, is that sometimes a development of understanding rules and abiding by the rules can be a challenge for that person, wherever they are doing in that area. They may actually find themselves sometimes frequently getting into trouble with rules of an institution, hopefully not legalities, but rules around what the expectation of that space is in their culture. They might not necessarily have an idea of how to set up proper rules and boundaries in relationships, proper rules and boundaries at work, proper rules and boundaries with their neighbors, or with their health. So cultivation of discipline is key here, but it's important to know that you've got to find that independent motivation to do it, because, again, with Saturn retrograde, there's nobody forcing you to do anything. With Uranus retrograde, one of the things that I would say is that a lot of what we talk about in present-day discussion or present-day transits definitely applies still to Uranus retrograde. Because when Uranus is retrograde, it's basically taking a lot of the randomness out, the intervention type of energy, the big left turn, the major shift in current, the major changing of the weather, so to speak, in the energy that Uranus is, the planet of revolution, rebellion, upgrades and improvements, and chaos. It's not there as much as one would think in a person's chart with Uranus retrograde. So this person's learning how to take charge of their own life not wait for a prompt from the external. The challenge with Uranus retrograde is that sometimes people do wait too much from a prompt from the external. I need a sign, I need a synchronicity. And those do exist for these folks, but they have to kind of be on their way. Again, kind of like Saturn retrograde, Uranus retrograde can talk a lot about that need for more independent motivation, wherever this is in this person's chart. I've seen Uranus retrograde in the 4th house of somebody's chart before, and you know, they didn't really do anything to change any norms, good or bad, in their family. They kind of just kept cycles, healthy and unhealthy, going, and they were aware of what they were doing, but what the problem was is that they kind of kept waiting for this prompt that was never going to come to change it themselves. You know, I want someone else to tell me what to do, or if this happens, then I'll do it, or something, if I need proof, I need a sign, again, a synchronicity. We don't always get those signals with Uranus retrograde. You have executive control. You can't go into it with salvation consciousness, though. You know, salvation consciousness is basically where we just kind of live for the miracles, right? We can't do that. We shouldn't do it anyway, but certainly not doubly so with Uranus retrograde. The good news about it is, though, is that we can take all of that and turn it on its head. This area of this person's life, and the area that Uranus rules, will not be as chaotic. You know, they won't have to worry so much about random upsets in family, or in job, or in love, or in their social life, or in their travels. They don't have to worry so much about things kind of getting thrown off and going all over the place, because again, that power is muted by the retrograde. Neptune retrograde is an interesting one because it's, honestly, I would say that it kind of has that very much 50-50 that Uranus does. I've got a Neptune retrograde in my natal chart, for instance. Neptune retrograde can indicate a spot where there is such a thing as maybe too much honesty, maybe oversharing, where a person may overshare information to a point where it's probably difficult for them to establish, I guess you could say, harmonious relationships in that area of their chart, or in general. Now, the reason I say that is because Neptune retrograde is basically refusal to overlook. And that can be tough to do because sometimes we do have to tell white lies, to just keep peace in relationships. And I'm talking about little white lies. I'm not talking about egregious, abhorrent affairs. I'm talking about little white lies like, yeah, that makes you look good, that kind of thing. Neptune retrograde kind of takes a lot of that out of it. And Neptune retrograde can also make it difficult for a person to let things slide. Remember, Neptune can be a very generous planet when direct. It's, Neptune can be very, very sweet, very fanciful, very idealistic, very encouraging and loving and empathetic. It's also the planet of, however, illusions and dreams and delusions and fantasy. So a person, may have too much of the rose-colored glasses situation going on with Neptune direct. Well, with Neptune retrograde, we've got, again, no rose-colored glasses, and perhaps an inability to see the merit in putting them on every once in a while. I can tell you right now, in my own case, Neptune retrograde in the 3rd house, if you haven't noticed, I like to mouth off, and I have a terrible tendency to do it, and it used to be a whole lot worse. And it was difficult for me to maintain certain relationships when I was in college because it was hard for me to sort of, I guess you could say, stop myself from just sort of being that too blunt. That's so blunt, it's socially awkward. I used to talk like that. Not all the time, but that used to be how I tried to relate to people. And that, sometimes with Neptune retrograde, it can indicate too much of an edge in that area. It's in my 3rd house of communications, and it rules my 5th house of love and romance and relationships with, my children, or even my relationships with my parents. And so, again, there's definitely some interplay there as far as, any kind of, maybe some harshness or, some difficulty holding on to things or indulging the people in these areas. So Neptune retrograde people tend to be very, very observant. They tend to see everything. They see all the truths, but they don't know when it's okay to let something slide. There can be a bit of self-righteousness that can come from it in there as well. And, there's always a lesson of learning to know the difference between doing the correct thing and doing the right thing. Okay, correctness is a poor man's right is something that I've had to learn, and I think it's a really, really good saying and it's a really, really good lesson. And I think a lot of Neptune retrograde people, we can sometimes accidentally alienate ourselves because again, if we're being cheap, we're going to aim for correct instead of right. Finally, we've got Pluto retrograde. And Pluto retrograde can indicate a place where a person does not make transitions easy, and they may not necessarily let things go as fast as they could, whether it's emotionally or physically. We do have a tendency to hoard the information, the experiences, and sometimes the physical objects of the house that Pluto is retrograde in. There's a bit of a situation there where something is not kept in proportion. Now, again, what house it's in, what house Pluto rules in your chart will tell you what's going on for you there. Pluto retrograde can be a little bit more negative than positive because it can indicate a situation where a lot of things can be on repeat. The same people, the same challenges, but also at the same time with Pluto retrograde, it can be a problem because this person may not necessarily feel comfortable making the final decision to punctuate a circumstance without other people being involved. If this is in the 8th house, they may not close business deals as quickly as they should. If it's in the 12th house, they may not necessarily get over the past. They constantly think about the past. And a lot of the times when you see Pluto retrograde, it can indicate a situation where something that by all accounts should be let go is getting ruminated over a little bit. And it's important to obviously get closure, but sometimes the only closure we get is finality. And that can be a lesson that these folks need to learn in whatever house it's in and whatever house it rules. Okay? So, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Just a little bit of crash course on retrogrades. We'll come back and revisit this once again, but I figured I would throw it up there for anyone just to pay attention to what's going on and how it's not that weird to have a retrograde in your chart. Heck, when it comes to outer planets going retrograde, half of us will have Neptune retrograde. Okay, Neptune will be retrograde, say, 6 months out of the year. Uranus will be retrograde 5 months out of the year. So it's not that weird, and it probably shouldn't be given the emphasis and, let's just say, exaggeration that it usually is by a lot of people. So, don't worry about your retrogrades, but explore them and look at them as opportunities. Remember, we're not chained to these are all lessons. So, I hope you found this helpful, everybody. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate it. And I will see you again very soon with more classes in June.